One tried to get on the scientific bandwagon. Darwin, whose theory of evolution has been called by some the single best idea ever to come to a human being, which I don't quite agree with. I think it's the non-aggression principle. But anyway, Darwin had an explanation for where we came from that was quite credible and remains quite credible to this day. And so everyone wanted to get on the bandwagon of science. Marx was one of those people. It was scientific socialism. It was supposed to be as rigorous and objective as a science. Kind of tough to push those into the social sciences like economics and so on. Everybody wants the certainty of physics and math and so on. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Marx. His family background was somewhat interesting. He came from famous intellectual Jews on both sides, although his father converted to Christianity as a result of laws against Jews attaining high professional status in where he was born. Marx seemed to have become a passionate Christian at some point. Then, of course, he started to work in revolutionary politics. He was a great polemicist. The poet aspect of Marx is something that is severely underappreciated. I don't know if people think he's like this cold-blooded rationalist or whatever, but he was an extremely apocalyptic and fevered poet as a young man. And he started writing poetry as a boy. There were two main themes. One was the love for his pale-faced girl next door, whose name was Jenny von Westphalen. And she had Scottish descent of some royalty, of some nobility, which he kind of pumped up later. He married her in 1841. So his first poetry was, poetic theme was love for his next-door neighbor. And the second was world destruction. He was very eschatological, very apocalyptic. So he had poems called Savage Songs, and they were, as you can imagine, not very song-like, but extremely savage. So he has an intense pessimism about the human condition. It's full of hatred, fascination with corruption and violence, a fascination with suicide pacts, which come out of some of the writings. The Sorrows of Young Werther is one of those. Suicide pacts and pacts with the devil. Tragically, as we'll see later, his daughters were intensely wrapped up in suicide pacts and died from some of them. So he wrote when he was young, we are chained, shattered, empty, frightened, eternally chained to this marble block of being. We are the apes of a cold God. He has himself, in the person of God, to say, I shall howl gigantic curses at mankind. And so there's this general sense of a world crisis building up, and he was very fond of quoting Mephistopheles' line from Goethe's Faust, everything that exists deserves to perish. And he had an intense hatred of lending money for interest or usury and money lenders. And I think it's fairly safe to say that given how wildly incompetent he was with money, how he spent his life wearing a groove back and forth to the pawn shop with all of his possessions went in and out of the pawn shop. At one point, he was actually the only person in his family able to leave the house because he had the last pair of trousers. And so the fact that he was constantly in hock, despite a pretty decent income, he was constantly in hock to money lenders, probably one of the problems. Now, he got a PhD. He was Hegelian, and I could do a show perhaps on Hegel. I wrote about Hegel in my master's thesis. Hegelianism, the world is created by thought. It is very subjectivist, mystical, irrational, and it has a very strong streak of Hegelian, or at least Hegel's followers were almost all in varying degrees anti-Semitic. In 1843, Bruno Bauer, the anti-Semitic leader of the Hegelian left, published an essay demanding that Jews abandon Judaism completely. And Marx wrote some essays in reply to this. He didn't object to any of the anti-Semitism. Indeed, he shared it, he endorsed it, he quoted it with approval. But he disagreed with the solution. He rejected Mao's belief that the antisocial nature of the Jew was religious in origin and could be remedied by tearing the Jew away from his faith. In Marx's opinion, the evil was social and economic. So this is what he wrote. He said, let us consider the real Jew, not the Sabbath Jew, but the everyday Jew. What was the profane basis of Judaism. Practical needs, self-interest. What is the worldly cult of the Jew? Huckstering. What is his worldly god? Money. And so he wrote that the Jews had gradually spread this practical religion to all society. He wrote, "Money is the jealous god of Israel, beside which no other god may exist. Money abases all the gods of mankind and changes them into commodities. Money is the self-sufficient value of all things. It has therefore deprived the whole world, both the human world and nature, of their own proper value. Money is the alienated essence of man's work and existence. This essence dominates him, and he worships it. The God of the Jews has been secularized and has become the God of this world." So, a hatred of money is, of course, very common to the left, despite the fact that they always seem to want a lot of it. They don't seem to be able to manage it very well. And they externalize their own incompetence, and because they always have problems with money, because they're financially retarded and self-destructive, they then say, well, my problem is money. No, your problem is incompetence with money, not money. It's like saying if you hold your breath, the problem is with air. Now, Marx, of course, wrote Das Kapital. He wrote about finance and industry his whole life, but he only knew two people who were actually connected with financial and industrial processes, and one of them, interesting connection, was his uncle in Holland, whose name was Lion Phillips. He was a successful businessman who founded what eventually became the vast Philips Electric Company, if you can imagine. I mean, wouldn't it have been great if Marx had sat down with his uncle and actually talked about capital and capitalism and workers and so on? But he only consulted him once. Marx only consulted his uncle Phillips on technical matters of high finance, although he did visit him 4 times. What he talked about, as far as can be ascertained, was just personal matters of family money. Now, of course, the other knowledgeable man was Engels himself, who had interest in factories, but Marx declined Engels' invitation to accompany him on a visit to a cotton mill, and so basically, as far as is known, Marx never set foot in a mill or a factory or a mine or any industrial workplace the whole of his life. So Engels was his partner, his bitch, basically, and was a co-author and a funder, particularly the last third of Marx's life. So in March 1946, Marx subjected a man named William Weitling to a kind of trial before the meeting of the Communist League in Brussels. Weitling was a true working-class hero, a poor, illegitimate son of a laundress, never had any idea who his father was. He was a tailor's apprentice, very smart, self-educated, a very hard worker. He won himself a large following among German workers. And what Marx did was he basically subjected him to a trial to put down this guy who was a working-class hero who lacked the abstract philosophical training that Marx felt was essential to the revolution. So Marx said that Weitling was guilty of conducting an agitation without doctrine. And he said, this is all fine in barbarous Russia, where you can build up successful unions with stupid young men and apostles, but in a civilized country like Germany, you must realize that nothing can be achieved without our doctrine. He said, if you attempt to influence the workers, especially the German workers, without a body of doctrine and clear scientific ideas, then you are merely playing an empty and unscrupulous game of propaganda, leading inevitably to the setting up on the one hand of an inspired apostle and on the other of open-mouthed donkeys listening to him. Weitling replied, he said, I didn't become a socialist to learn about doctrines manufactured in a library. I speak for actual working men and will not submit to the views of mere theoreticians who are remote from the suffering of real labor. And this, said an eyewitness, so enraged Marx that he struck his fist on the table so violently that the lamp shook. Jumping to his feet, he shouted, any uppity working-class type who lacked the philosophical training he thought essential was a monster and should have nothing to do with anything. He said, ignorance has never solved any problem. And there's another guy named Lassalle who became the victim of Marx's most brutal anti-Semitic and racial sneers. He was Baron Itzig, the Jewish nigger. He said he's a greasy Jew. This is Marx's words, a greasy Jew disguised under brilliantine and cheap jewels. It is now perfectly clear to me, Marx wrote to Engels on 30th July 1862, that as the shape of his head and the growth of his hair indicates he is descended from the Negroes who joined in Moses' flight in Egypt, unless his mother or grandmother on his father's side was crossed with a nigger. The union of Jew and German on a Negro base was bound to produce an extraordinary hybrid. So Marx didn't actually investigate working conditions himself, despite access to factories through Engels. He did not learn from intelligent working men who had experienced them. And Karl Jaspers, as a philosopher, in particular a philosopher of science, he said the style of Marx's writings is not that of the investigator. He does not quote examples or use facts which run counter to his own theory, but only those which clearly support or confirm that which he considers the ultimate truth. The whole approach is one of vindication, not investigation, but it is a vindication of something proclaimed as the perfect truth, with the conviction not of the scientist, but of the thinker. And this is basic to the exploration of truth in the world. We all have theories, and we have confirmation bias with regards to those theories, and what we need to do is expose ourselves to opposite arguments and opposite information, and to proclaim that empirical theories are always forever the absolute truth. It's irrational in science. They're always testable. New information can always change them. And Marx had these theories from the beginning and went out, as Engels did, as we'll see, to find proof for that which he already was convinced was the absolute truth. That is the complete opposite of science. That is religious. It's the opposite of philosophy. That is religious. Okay, so just very briefly going into theories, Marx's pages that capitalism and free trade by its very nature involves the progressive and increasing exploitation of workers. So the more capital that is employed in an industry, the more the workers will be exploited. And as capital increases in investments among the workers get more and more exploited, and then they eventually have a revolution, blah, blah, blah. So if this is your theory, yeah, great, have a theory, try to prove it. That's great stuff. So, again, I'm taking from the book here. So, Marx has to prove that, one, there were bad conditions. Everybody knows there were bad conditions for workers in pre-capitalist eras, but they become worse under industrial capitalism. And also, the more capital that is invested in an industry, the worse the condition of the workers must be. I say that the more capital, the more exploitation. Then I have to compare medieval working conditions to industrial working conditions, and then I have to compare the more concentrated capital industries to less concentrated capital industries. He doesn't do that. Now, you can to some degree promote their feet, and everybody trying to get out of the countryside into the city. The countryside throughout the Middle Ages, the late Middle Ages, was rife with starvation and massive problems. And so they tried to get into the cities. Part of that was the enclosure movement, where some people were at their land bought or kicked off their land, but a lot of it was just people trying to get into cities because it was better. So Marx refers to a book that Engels wrote, and unfortunately what Engels wrote was, again, just a piece of ideology affirming propaganda. So careful checking of Engels' abstract from the second sources shows these are often truncated, condensed, garbled, or twisted, but inevitably putting quotation marks as though given verbatim. So, through one edition of Engels' book on the working class, footnotes catalog his distortions and dishonesties. In one section alone, chapter 7, the proletariat, falsehoods, including errors of fact and transcription, occur on pages 152, 155, 157, 59, 60, 63, 65, 66, 68, 70, 72, 74, 78, 79, 182, 85, 86, 88, 89, 190, 191, 134, and 203. Now, Marx knew about the weaknesses of and dishonesty of Engels' book on working class because a lot of them were exposed as early as 1848 by the German economist Bruno Hildebrand, a publication with which Marx was familiar. So, this is not the indifferent, open-minded, rigorous, and self-critical exploration of truth. This is a true believer that whatever pseudo-facts he can in order to bolster up his house of cards and This is quite